I can't hear Andrew at the moment.
Thank you for joining today's webinar. You are being held in the lobby. The webinar will be starting soon. Thank you for joining today's webinar. You are being held in the lobby. The webinar will be starting soon.
Good evening. Welcome to all participants who have joined this webinar this evening, which is about how to become a chartered engineer. We're just waiting for the last few attendees to join, and then Robert will start his speech, his session shortly. My name is Andrew Dodd. I'm a member of the IET Bucks Committee. I coordinate the events that we hold in Buckinghamshire. We normally run quite an intensive program, at least one event per month, but obviously with the recent events, the COVID-19 lockdown, we've had to scrap our program other than Robert's seminar, which we thought was important to still hold. We were hoping to hold it in person, but obviously we're now doing it via Zoom. We're hoping to restart our program in September, and you're cordially invited to join us if you wish to. Keep a lookout for Bucks IET events. Currently, we've got an event which will be coming up in November, which is our annual Cisco lecture, and we're looking at a 5G topic where Cisco are looking at how they will implement 5G and emphasizing that 5G isn't all about mobile phones and radio interconnects. There's a lot of work on clouds and servers as well. So that will be coming up in the middle of November, and we look forward to seeing you. Right, okay. With no further ado, I'd like to introduce Rob Wright, who's going to give tonight's seminar. Rob is a professional registration advisor with a wealth of experience in helping candidates to become chartered engineer. He's going to deliver his seminar in one go. If you want to post questions, there is a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Please use that. We will keep a look at the questions that are being asked, and Robert will also look at them, and at the end we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. We'll see if there's some commonality in them. All questions are logged, so if your question isn't asked tonight, we will look at what questions have been asked, because they will be logged and sent to us afterwards. With that, Rob, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll just share my screen. Just bear with me while I bring that up. Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. As Andrew said, this is the third time that I've given this presentation over the last 2-3 years. Just to give you an idea of why I ended the presentation, I have been a member of the IET since 1996 and a chartered engineer since 2001, and I've been increasingly involved in the support for people both in terms of professional advice and interviews with the IET since 2012. I am a member of the Royal Air Force, and it's quite a large number of my peers are also chartered engineers, and that is one of the areas where potentially most of my experience in terms of interviewing and advice comes from. And my background is working with ground-based military communication systems, so quite a wide discipline there that brings in a number of different engineering aspects. why would you like to register? I think is the reason why we're all here this evening. And there are really three perspectives, I suppose, on why registration is important, not just for the individual, but also for the organisations as well. Employers have the assurance of knowing that they've have engineers on their base of a particular caliber, recognized standards both as incorporated engineers, EngTech, or as chartered engineers. The standards are clearly understood by wider industry. Other engineers, other professionals have the benefit of knowing that they're dealing with people, again, that have reached a particular level of chartership. And where international standards are concerned, engineers can share the knowledge safe in the understanding that that they're dealing with peers who have the same level, the same standard of understanding of the engineering world. And the economy itself benefits from a more engineering cadre across the piece. So there are a number of different reasons why registration is important for us all, and it's a combination of those three elements generally that drive individuals towards the registration route at whichever level they choose to register. But before we go any further, I think it's fair to say that the IET doesn't have the monopoly on registration, and it's very important from the outset that you find the best fit in terms of the institute that best caters for you, both in terms of your career aspirations, but also your past experience and knowledge as well. And I found in my experience that the majority of people that I speak to, if it isn't the IET that they are more comfortable with, then it tends to be the Chartered Management Institute. Potentially at particular points in careers, the emphasis from engineering changes subtly, and it's important to understand whether your performance, your track record, and your career aspirations for the future, more importantly, are balanced towards the IET or another institute. But that's the only time I'm going to mention a competitor institute as we move forward. I just felt it was appropriate to bring that up. And I think the other question that I get asked most is, which level of registration should I be aiming for? And that's a very personal perspective, and it depends on a number of things. It depends on the amount of experience you have, the amount of responsibility you have, the point where you are in your career, and also your educational background as well. And by and large, this model on the screen here, Ground Rules 2, slide number 6, for those that can see it, just gives an indication of how the different perspectives generally work. Those that are responsible for delivering projects against performance, time, and cost parameters tend to be incorporated engineers or EngTechs. Those that are setting the parameters for those projects and determining budgets and determining timescales or cost overheads or the performance parameters tend to be aiming for chartered engineer. And it's a very broad model. It just shows in a single view there where the potential emphasis lies between the three tiers of registration, and that's not to say that any one is more or less important than the other. It is very much the level of registration that best suits the individual. A little bit more detail here, just to give a background. All the information is available on the IET website, and you'll see as we go forward some links, some steers for the links to look at there. But essentially, engineering technicians are practitioners. They tend to apply safe systems of work, and their responsibility is to work alongside other staff as generally part of larger teams. Incorporated engineers become a little bit more specialized. Generally, they're a little bit further along their career path, and they are starting to become involved in the development of technologies and having a hand in the design rather than the implementation of the engineering. And these are all very broad definitions, but they are the guidelines, if if you like, to consider when you're looking at which level of registration that maybe suits you best as you go forward. Again, as you go along the career path, potentially more responsibility laid at the shoulders of incorporated engineers, the need for them to work independently on occasions, and to lead other teams and themselves moving forward. So a degree of leadership as well as management starts to come into the mix there for incorporated engineers. And then taking that forward, chartered engineers are responsible for, say, the design, the setting of the parameters against which others generally work to. Judgment becomes important, and the increasing requirement to assume and hold responsibilities, and be responsible for the innovation, the driving forward of some of the engineering practices, the development of new techniques, to be the pathfinders for others to work to as they move forward there. So again, these are broad levels of responsibility, but they are the phrasings that tend to come out from documents generated by Engineering Council and also by the IET as well. So I've just pulled out key phrases there in red for this. The other thing to consider, I think I mentioned it briefly there, is educational standards, and the rules for the categories of engineering registration have changed over the years. This slide just gives a highlight how SARTOR UK spec have worked together over the years, and since 1999 it's been a requirement for chartered engineer from an education perspective to have a Masters of Engineering as the baseline for chartered engineer. That's not to say that people without a master's degree aren't eligible for a chartered engineer, because in lieu of qualification also counts. But for the vast majority of engineers currently looking for registration as chartered, I would suggest that the educational baseline of MEng applies in the most part. Clearly, you can always ask why the standards have changed over the years, and there are all sorts of reasons why, and suggestions as to why. It's not to say that a bachelor's degree is any less relevant or just the way that the society has viewed the requirements moving forward, and the institutes and the Eng Council have moved with the times there, in line with other countries, and in line with other professions as well. I've mentioned the Eng Council, and I think it's really important at this stage to point out the foundation stone document on which this presentation is based, and which you must really refer to in your journey towards registration, and that is the UK spec document released by the Engineering Council, and it shows for each tier of registration the 5 criterion that are common across all of those classes, and they're listed on the screen there. Knowledge and understanding speaks for itself. This is understanding what your educational background is, and what your knowledge in lieu of education might be. Criteria B, about application of that knowledge to analysis and solutions, and then technical commercial leadership becomes an increasingly important aspect of registration as you look at chartered engineer. Interpersonal skill, clearly engineers need to be able to work with others first and foremost, and so interpersonal skills is important. And increasingly within the institute and within the Eng Council, commitment to standards and increasingly ethics now, and sustainability, the stability in engineering, is increasingly important. And when you look at the EngSpec document, it appears at first glance to be a repetition 3 times over of the same information, because the same criteria apply to each stage of registration. The wording within the criteria, the guidelines within the criteria are very, very similar. But the subtleties, as I've alluded to in the previous slides there, start to come out in the wording and the emphasis on the aspects that are being looked at each different tier. And so this is the document that the IT use to understand whether or not people are eligible at each stage of the registration process. It's the cornerstone document which underpins registration, and it is the Eng Council ultimately that provide the registration, the Chartered Engineer status. So it's very, very important out of your journey towards registration that you look at the website, look at the Eng Council website, download the PDF copy of this document, and really use it as your reference moving forward. It is the single most important source of information that you can really require, and it will answer a lot of the questions moving forward. When it comes to showing your application process, read the document very carefully, use the similar phrasing to the one in the document to frame your evidence, and you'll present your evidence then in a way which the interviewers and each stage of the IET checking process will be familiar with, and it removes any ambiguity as well in terms of framing your evidence. Engineering is a very broad discipline. So using this framework, which is well understood, helps you to put your evidence in the bank forward. I can't recommend this document enough to those of you that are looking for a cue and looking for information to start framing your process. The website, and again, the UK spec, the website view may have changed slightly from this slide, but information is downloadable from the UK spec website there. It's a free document, and as I say, I can't recommend it enough in terms of helping you to frame your application. And we've talked a little bit about registration as in terms of the classes of registration, but what about the process itself? What is it the process is to achieve? And essentially, this is the mechanism by which you translate what you are capable of, what you've done, your achievements, and your knowledge into a framework which is then assessed by peers and accredited at a particular standard of registration. So it's a mixture of things, and it's demonstrated in different ways, and it comes from, and the blend of evidence changes from person to person, but essentially it is about academic qualifications or experience in lieu. It's about the training that you do, and also importantly the training that you hope to do moving forward, because part of the responsibility of being a professional engineer is to commit to continual professional development, and that the journey of enrichment doesn't stop with registration. It only starts at that point. So a need to understand how it is you see your career, your training, and your education developing from that point on is very, very important moving forward. And it is also the kudos that comes from being part of a well-respected institute, a body of engineers, and so there is a degree of peer bonding as well that comes from the process moving forward. And it's a 4-stage process that the IET uses moving in. Again, this is underwritten by the Eng Council, but I think it's important to understand that the application is just one part. It's effectively the first part of the process. It's arguably the most difficult part of the process, because there are a lot of engineers, very, very good engineers out there that promise me fairly that they will, when they get round to it, they will fill in their application, and they've been telling me that for many, many years. So filling in the application form and actually putting the information into the correct format is definitely the hardest part of the process. And arguably it shouldn't be, because there are professional registration advisors available through the IET that can be assigned to people that can take you through the process from the outset to give you the same kind of information that I'm giving out of the application process. They can also review your application form as it develops. They can't write it for you, but they can certainly give you some advice and recommendations about how to present the information that you have in the best way moving forward. And also their advice is really important, because it helps then with the second stage, which is the compliance review. And again, not everybody uses a professional registration advisor. Some people can quite easily put the information into the correct format. Other people struggle. So stage 2 is really a moderating level where the evidence is checked for compliance with the NSPEC requirements and the institute's requirements, but it's also checked for compliance in terms of format as well. So there are some rules around how you write the application. If the application, for instance, is simply insufficient, then it will be returned at stage 2. Similarly, if the application is excessively long, that also may get returned at stage 2 for rework. But assuming that the application meets the compliance criteria, then the next stage of the process is the peer interview. And this is really, really important. This is an opportunity to fill in the gaps. Every application has a number of areas of this in terms of evidence against the criteria that we talked about previously. So the peer interview, and it's really important to stress that this is an interview of peers. It isn't an interview, for instance, for a job. It's pass or fail in terms of you're going to get a grilling over what you've written. It's an opportunity for the peer interviewers to tease out any additional information that they feel is appropriate, that stage 2 might have recommended needs to be investigated in a little bit more detail. And the idea of the interview is to give you every benefit to show the extra information, if it's needed, is there. And it's also an opportunity for you to present a topic of your choice as part of the interview there, to really showcase your skills and your credibility as an engineer at the level that you're applying for. And the final stage of the process, stage 4, is another validation of the interview stage. So there are 2-stage checks, if you like, in this 4-stage process, and you should take comfort in that if the interview didn't go as well as you hoped, then the interviews are batched together over a period of time, 3 or 4 weeks, up to 2 months or so. And the interviews, when they are reviewed at stage 4, they're moderated, and internal checks and balances to make sure that that interview process was conducted correctly. So every opportunity, I suppose, to work in favour of the individual is applied in that process. So take apart from the structure stage is the first one, and that's really down to individual effort to make sure that that you fill the form in a timely way. The longer you leave it to start filling in more, the harder it is. The further into your career you get, the more distant the memories become in terms of what you did at the start of your career. And while it's important, it needs to be captured effectively. It becomes more difficult every decade that passes that you haven't reformed. It's more difficult. I know this from talking to my peers that have left it arguably too long to fill the form in. I've mentioned the NSPEC, Eng Council website. There's more information on. You'll see these slides throughout the presentation. Everything to know, and all of the things I'm talking about now are covered in far more detail on the IET website. And I strongly recommend, alongside document, if you haven't already done so, you invest time in finding your way around the IET website, because, as I say, all of the answers to the questions you have, I would suggest, are on that website, and there's a lot of information there to help you on your journey over and above this webinar and the occasional contact that you may have with a professional registration advisor moving forward. And so again, the screenshots might have changed slightly. They do refresh quite regularly, but the links, importantly, are fairly consistent through the iterations of the website. And again, we've talked about the broad outline of what constitutes each tier of registration. There's more detail on the website there to help you as an individual decide which layer, which tier, if you like, of registration might suit you best. And for some people, they're very clear on which level that they want to aim for, and when they're there, that's acceptable. Others see it as a journey, and others see it as a race to the top. Each view is valid, but actually, I think the pragmatic way of looking at this is as a journey. A career is a journey, and therefore registration should be a journey as well. And a staged approach works for a lot of people. Certainly in my experience, I've seen a lot of people that I've registered initially either as ICT techs or incorporated engineers, and then I've had the pleasure of seeing them 2, 3, 4 years later revisit the registration process to move to the next tier that they feel is appropriate for them moving forward. And so again, it's kind of career development, a sense of achievement at each stage, but each stage is equally valid for individuals. The other important tool, and again, stress this enough really, is Career Manager. If you've got a lot of pieces of paper, as I have, or lots of documents stored on my computer piecemeal, then Career Manager is the tool that will help to bring it all together in a more coherent, consolidated way, and it allows you to put information in a framework which can ultimately then assist with the application process. So again, if you're going to engage in any aspect of the IT website, then Career Manager, once you've decided what tier of registration that you are interested in, then I suggest investing some time. It would be time well spent. I think it's important as well to point out that the process takes its own time. It's a 4-stage process, as we talked about previously, and it tends to be the case that batches of applications or the applications are batched together at each stage of the process. So while it generally completes within a time frame, there are quite wide variations depending on whether you're at the start of the batching process at each stage or the end, as to whether or not it works more quickly or less for yourself. So I think it's important to allow a certain amount of time. It certainly won't happen overnight, and 4 to 5 months seems to be about the average time for time from the application is submitted to when you have a decision about whether or not your registration has been accepted. As you're putting the application together, there's a package of documentation that you need to submit either electronically or in hard copy. Clearly, copies of academic certificates and awards, the overview of your employment history and responsibilities. And importantly, I think the thing that sometimes gets overlooked is a copy of your development action plan. That's really important that you enclose it at this stage, because then while it might change between when you submit it and when you go to interview, it shows that you've already thought from the outset about this continual professional development aspect. And the development action plan need to be an elaborate document. The best ones that I've seen tend to be a landscape piece of A4 with 3 rows, near term, medium term, and long term, with some pragmatic and achievable development aims against each of those 3 timelines. It's probably the first or the next 12 to 18 months, medium term 18 months to 3 years, and longer term 3 years out as far as you feel is appropriate. Most people that I've seen good development action plans have career development courses, technical courses in that first bracket, and then in the medium to long-term bracket, continual academic development, a master's degree, a first master's degree, or a further master's degree, or a completely different type of academic study. Some people decide in their career journey that a change of direction is important. It still may be within the engineering profession broadly, but it may be a completely change of specialization that requires more detailed training. But the action plan, however you frame it and however much detail you go in, it's worth having some thoughts about that at the start of the process, rather than waiting until you've got your interview date and then putting something together at the last minute, which just doesn't seem as credible. And clearly the application fee, as well as appropriate, needs to be included at that stage. I've mentioned the application form, that it is the most difficult first step, and these are just really some guidelines. Most people word process, very few of them are handwritten, but be careful how you present it. The trick to write as much as you possibly can in as small a font as possible to get to within the page limit. 6 pages is par for the course, maximum length. I've seen some very, very good applications written in less pages than that. Anything over 6 pages becomes a little bit difficult and cumbersome. Certainly at the interview, the interviewers have a limited amount of time to review each application after the interview, and they use that as a handrail during the interview. You have 1 hour during which you've got to present the information. So anything more than 6 pages of evidence tends to be quite cumbersome, and I'll argue the amount of information no greater in more than 6 pages than in less. It's just the way it needs to be framed. It's really important that you present the information in a concise and brief format, while still conveying all of the evidence that needs to be conveyed. Again, you don't need lots of extra supporting document beyond the application form. Some people bring further evidence, documentary evidence, to interview, normally drawings, diagrams, or occasionally some slide presentations or brochures, material from their workplace, which reiterates what it is that they've done. But that doesn't need to be included at the outset with the application form. Just breaking that form down in a little bit more detail, it's set out in a number of parts, and clearly education and experience are fundamental. The A-class criteria, A and B, are the areas which potentially cause candidates the most concern, in that is providing the evidence that's required for the standard of registration that they're aiming for. And so it's really important that you spend some time, and again, reiterate throughout the presentation the benefit of having some advice from a professional registration advisor in terms of making sure that the evidence that you think is appropriate is actually valid, rather than putting a lot of information which subsequently isn't necessarily going to help the registration process. Everything in the application should be intended towards presenting your case in the most positive way, while certain training courses may be relevant and appropriate to your career, they must have relevance to the registration process, and it might be more conducive in some cases to put together a number of short internal courses, so that you show a trend for the incremental, small, short duration courses that don't necessarily mean as much to the interviewers and to the reviewers moving forward. So how you frame your experience, again, is very, very important. There is a box within the application there for published material, and again, not everybody has the ability to publish patents or papers in their own name. And so if you haven't published any papers or you can't attribute any patents, then leave that area blank. There are certain parts of the form which it's best to leave blank if you don't have firm evidence to support. And so providing that extra level of experience, if you don't have it, it doesn't need to be filled in. It's only for those areas where people can produce that evidence that it's relevant. And I think it's important that conversely, you show how you're involved in the community in a wider sense from an engineering perspective. STEM initiatives are very appropriate means of showing evidence that you're involved in engineering beyond the workplace, because it is more of a vocation and a profession than simply what you do in your daily job. So there is evidence that is important to put in there, but it needs to be framed accordingly. And I think, again, it's important to note that while the IET will, wherever possible, try and match the interviewers to a broad area of specialization. As I said before, engineering is a very, very broad church, and therefore it won't always be possible to have certainly two interviewees that understand implicitly what it is that you do. So keep abbreviate, keep terminology to a minimum, clear phrasing, explain it in clear English, what it is that you do, why you do it, how you do it. And if you have to use abbreviations and acronyms, then stamp for first use so that people can see. They don't have to try and struggle to understand what it is that you do through the acronym soup. Everybody generally, unless they're a single person company, works within an organization, for an organization, or to an organization. And so the accountability diagram is a good way, single view, very simple, high-level diagram view of showing how you fit into the organization. And it's really useful on that diagram, not just show your position, but also show relative to other members of the organization how registration works. So if you work alongside a number of chartered engineers at the same peer level, and you know that they're registered and chartered, not necessarily chartered engineers with the IET, I mean, they could be Royal Aero, they could be any number of institutes, but as long as you can show how you fit relative to other engineers of a similar registration group within the organization, that's very, very useful. It doesn't need to be, as I say, a complicated diagram. It doesn't need to show the whole organization. It just needs to show your near peer organization, who you work for, who you work alongside, and who works for you. Those three tiers in a very simple wiring diagram is all that's required. And again, you don't need to show an organizational diagram for every you worked over. If you have changed responsibilities significantly or jobs significantly in the last 3 years or so, then showing a previous accountability, it helps, it is useful, but certainly no more than 2, showing your current and previous employment. I've mentioned carefully and concisely, when you talk about your employment history, there are 2. You can show earliest employment first, or most recent employment first. Generally, people tend to show it chronologically. They work from their earliest employment and they show that in least detail. And as you move through the document, you get slightly more detail the closer to different position that you see. And again, it's a fine balance between writing too much and not writing enough. A good here is when you're writing your experience down in draft form, is have the UK spec document open alongside. You see, or every time you write down an example of evidence, match it against one of the criteria in the framework. Go through the document doing that, almost sentence by sentence, and then review the document end to end and see where you've got all criteria, and then rebalance the document accordingly. So it may require a little bit of extra thought. You may have to really strain to look for some evidence in certain areas of the criteria, But simply, if you've written a lot of things against just one or two of the criteria in the framework, then you probably highlighted the right balance of evidence in the document overall. So it becomes a refinement process. And it may well be that a piece of evidence that you've put against one criteria needs to be brought to better meet one of the other criteria. It may be that the evidence is valid. It just means that you haven't necessarily framed it to the correct criteria in the first stage. So refining the document, reading it end to end, and again, drawing on the expertise and experience of a professional registration advisor during the process is a really useful piece of advice. This document isn't something you can write end to end in a single shot. This part of the application process, it needs a little bit of refinement, a little bit of iteration to ensure that it's as good as it can be. And again, bear in mind, remember that the aim of the exercise is to show evidence against the UK spec criteria. So it's got to be able to be validated. You've got to be confident that what you're writing is correct. But the aim is to write evidence against the criteria. So it's not a CV, it's not a job interview, it's a body of evidence against a clearly articulated set of criteria. So you have the answer in the criteria, you just need to provide the evidence around that framework. Another really important point, and this comes at an interview is that it's your effort. You're being measured against what you've done, not what the team has done, what your organization has done. We all generally default to we're all generally defaulting to teamwork, as we like to think we're part of a bigger effort. Really important, both in the application process, the wording of the application written, and also in the way that you interact in the interview, that it's individual effort. One person whose evidence is being measured here is yours as the candidate and the applicant. So prolific use of I, limited use of we is the way forward there. It seems rather selfish and counterintuitive for most people, but actually we're not measuring the team effort here, we're measuring the individual contribution. And so it's really important that you frame the sentences and the interviewing in that aspect. Quite a wordy slide here, and again, I'll just draw out the red areas there, reiterating the previous slide there. It's direct involvement, direct engagement, direct responsibility for things. If you have budgetary responsibilities, then how much of a budget do you have responsibility for? Certainly in the military, one of the areas that causes problems for some of the applicants that I deal with is the budgets are quite large, but the individual responsibility generally is quite small. So I always get a little feeling of uncertainty when I see an application that talks in terms of £1 million budgets when the individual really only had responsibility for a small proportion of that money directly. So it's how much direct responsibility that you have, and how much direct input do you put into particular projects. How much direct responsibility do you have in proportion to a larger effort? It's fine to show how that proportionally works as part of a larger effort. But clearly the more important, the more relevant evidence is that which you are predominantly responsible for yourself. I think it's important as well to note that the importance of supporters and proposers. The guidance on this changes and has changed. You generally don't need more than 2 supporters now, but it's important to have ideally 2 people, 2 engineers with which you're familiar, that will support your application, and if necessary can be referred to for clarification should the need arise for any particular aspect of the application. So understanding the requirement to have a supporter, I think, is important as you go forward. Choosing your supporter, clearly, it can't be your your PRA, but it can be somebody within the organisation. It could be one of your peers. It could be a supervisor. Generally, it's going to be in those two brackets of the organisation, I would suggest, or it could be somebody who works in a sister organisation. Who knows you as an engineer and can validate your application accordingly. Just moving forward now and looking at the interview, stepping forward. So this assumes your application has been successful, it's been crafted, you've had the advice of a PRA, or you've managed to string together all of the information that's necessary and put together a credible application. It's stage 2. And you're now at the point of interview. The interview, I say it lasts about an hour. The interviews generally last an hour. And within that period, 15 minutes or so is allocated normally for the interview, for the presentation that you provide. Most interviewers will give you the option of them asking questions as you deliver your presentation. Some people prefer to wait to the end of the presentation to ask questions. Some people are quite happy to have questions asked of them during the presentation. I would suggest probably the latter is better, because then the 15-minute window becomes a slightly elastic period of time. The interviewers will ask questions, they will dip in to some of the comments, and they will tease away for further lines of inquiry around the presentation, rather than limit the delivery to 15 minutes and take questions and then move into the main part of the interview. It's ideally that's the way that the interviews intend to work. At practice, the interviewers tend to take a more dynamic approach, and certainly I prefer the options of a candidate as they are presenting, because it allows them to, as I say, draw down into other areas and tease out some other aspects potentially for investigation in a way which is natural and works quite well. Otherwise, you end up saving questions to the end of the presentation. It becomes rather difficult to go back over the ground in an appropriate way. And this isn't a technical interview. This is an interview to check your evidence against the criteria. Everything works around that framework and that criteria. So the interview there is to validate your evidence, and just to make sure, if necessary, appropriate, that any other evidence can be demonstrated by the interviewee during the course of the interview. And the interviewers are experienced enough to draw that information out during the course of the interview, if the information is there. So rest assured that if there are gaps in your competency on the application process, but you have that evidence, then the interview will draw it out. If that evidence doesn't exist and it can't be drawn out in the interview, then it probably doesn't exist, in which case the application is rightly returned at that point. So it's a fairer process. I mean, there is a degree of subjectivity in interviews, there always will be, but in terms of fairness to the candidates, I think it is a very fair and appropriate mechanism of that final check and balance that's required of the Institute moving forward. And again, commercial sensitivities, there is no requirement to dip into commercial sensitivities. There is no requirement to dip into the official secrets level of detail. The evidence can be provided by the individual in a very high level form. The interviewers understand when they hear the right set of words related to a particular question. That's all. They don't need to dip in. It's not a highly investigative process about the intent and response. It's about you as an individual showing the evidence against the criteria. So please don't worry that the interview becomes an interrogation. It's certainly not an interrogation, and it should not reveal anything that's sensitive about any of the organisations that you've worked for in the past or moving forward. what happens? The interview, as I say, lasts about an hour. You get the opportunity to offer any other evidence you think might be appropriate, or any questions that you feel that haven't been asked, that you feel would normally allow 5 to 10 minutes at the end of the interview, just to ensure that everything you feel is appropriate as an individual has been presented to the panel. And very often, I would say 30% of the time, that 10 minutes is really useful, because something just comes out at the end when the pressure is off, and people have a moment of clarity just before they leave the room, and a little nugget of information will come out at that point, which doesn't necessarily sway the interview, but it certainly adds that extra little bit of value just at the end. So please think carefully before you go into the interview about what it is that you want to put across within the framework, and hold that thought. And if that doesn't come out during the course of the interview, then please offer that information prior to leaving the room. You can't put any more information into the process after the interview, so it's better to put that point forward, even if it's not relevant. It's better to put that point forward, have it considered, than to leave with a regret that you didn't raise it. After the interview, the two interviewers compile their report on the interview. It's done electronically now, so laptop in the room, in the interview room. The post-interview report is written immediately after the interview. Is allowed during the course of the day. Generally, viewers will interview maximum of 4 candidates a day, 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. That's right. So you've got 2 hours of interviewing, and you've probably got then 2 hours of writing the notes from the interviews. So the interviews are timed accordingly to allow that time. And actually, by the end of the day, if 4 interviews is on the schedule, then I certainly leave the interview room quite drained at the end of the day. So any more would be a disservice to the candidates. Anything less than 3 interviews, and generally, given the issues, certainly prior to COVID, the issues getting in and out of London made it not necessarily worthwhile for people to travel long distances. So 3 to 4 interviews a day is about appropriate to get the best from the interviewers, from the candidates, and to make the exercise worthwhile for the institute as well. And so the final stage then is the validation, the stage 4, which looks across a number of interviews, a batch of interviews, and ensures that the interviewers and the organisation has conducted itself correctly, and it moderates then to ensure that there's as even-handed approach as possible across various different interviewers. Again, the interviewers come from a very, very wide background of experience and ages as well. Each has its own. Each of us have our own different approach within the framework, but each of us aspires to deliver the fairest and appropriate interviews that we can. And so that stage 4 is your assurance that all of the interview panels are moderated accordingly. And that's why the process overall can take quite a considerable amount of time, because if you imagine that 30 or so interviews will be put together into a moderation batch, then it could take 2 to 3 weeks to just do those interviews. Then they need to be moderated. And so that's 4 or 5 months overall across all 4 stages. And that is a reasonable expectation you need to have going forward. So if you put, as I say, expect it to be handled and the process to be completed nominally within 4 to 5 months. Sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit longer. And again, I reiterate the easy thing, I suppose, going forward. Know the UK spec framework, the 4 competencies and the commitment. So we commit to being ethical engineers, we commit to sustainable engineering. The other 4 elements are competencies that we need to be able to display evidence against. Use Career Manager it is a good tool. It has evolved and developed significantly over the years. It was initially quite a clunky process, but now it's almost as intuitive as writing the form in Word, really. But it provides you with the framework and directs your efforts a little bit more closely than just doing it as a word process document. Professional registration advisors are there to help you. Please don't abuse their time and expect them to write the application for you. So use them little and often, I think, is probably the fairest thing I can say there. They will happily engage at each stage of the process. Maybe an initial conversation just to frame your thoughts. Then at the point where you have an early draft of your application, and certainly your work experience and evidence in the first approximation, and then possibly a third or fourth engagement once you've refined that document and taken their advice and applied it to the form. And then it's always good. I find it really quite heartening when people get in touch post the interview and post the registration process to say, yep, absolutely happy. Thank you. I've successfully registered as an engineer at this level. It's just a nice rounding off process. Not everybody does it, but it is nice to know, A, that the advice that you've given has actually hit the mark and has been effective, and recognition, really, I suppose, to people for investing the effort. It takes time to give people appropriate information because you're reading into the application and you're trying to give them the best advice you can based on very limited understanding of them as individuals. But the final point there is prepare. You know, at each stage you need to prepare, but specifically for the interview, the more you can do in terms of understanding your topic of presentation, really understanding it, not just working to a script or working to a PowerPoint set of PowerPoint slides, really understand what it is that you want to show in your 15 minutes of evidence, what areas you'll know before you start framing your presentation, which areas of the criteria you have the least evidence for. And I would suggest you use the presentation to top up those areas with a really good, punchy example based on experience there. And almost that piece of advice will allow the interviewers to see straight away, without asking too many questions, that you've understood the framework, you've clearly anticipated where some of their questioning might go, and you've presented evidence proactively your patient to mitigate some of those questions and to effectively address those questions. And it's clear the people that have taken that piece of advice on board, vice those that have put together a favourite topic that may or may not provide the evidence necessary, but it's something they're comfortable about talking about. And then they've delivered 15 minutes of very interesting monologue, but it hasn't necessarily added much in the way of value to evidence for their registration. So while it might be an entertaining 15 minutes of delivery, it isn't necessarily the most effective use of the time in the larger piece. So prepare very carefully based on everything you know about self, everything you know about the application process, and everything you've been able to glean from these kind of engagements, and then you'll be on a safe footing, I think, or as well prepared as you can be, I should say, for the interview itself. Right, that's the end of the slideshow from my perspective. I know that we have a number of questions. I can see there are over questions up quite quickly. Andrew, I don't know if you want to close off proceedings at this point and round things off?
Right. Well, Robert, I will ask a few questions on behalf of people. I've sort of been looking at what's coming in, and I will try to ask one or two questions of you that have come along a few times. And we've got a couple of people who would like to ask a question live. So that's Lee McFadden and Jose Garcia. And assuming they're still on the call, I'll let them in a moment. As I understand it, anybody's asked a question via the Q&A button that has been recorded, a log somewhere, and we'll do our level best to get back and answer the questions for you. The one question, Robert, that has come up a number of times is, will we be emailing your presentation to the attendees of tonight's meeting?
I have no problem with sharing it, Andrew. Again, it's my view. As you know, it's based on experience. So whether or not the IET would feel the same way is a question, really. I'm happy to share it on the proviso that it's not necessarily the official IET line. As I say, it's based on experience, and it's there to help candidates. There's nothing I've said which I is untrue, but I'll leave that to your judgment, and maybe Julie to decide on how much or how little of the presentation. Certainly some of the slides certainly can be shared, I would imagine.
Well, I think in past years, we have shared the presentation for anybody who's come along to the physical meeting. I don't see any difference on this one. Obviously, the copyright's yours and it's your personal views, but Julie will put suitable provisos around it, as much as I do when I've sent it out on your behalf, to make sure that your copyright isn't destroyed. Right, let's have a look at some other questions. Oh yes, so one that's very pertinent for these times. Do you think that meetings are going to be held online as opposed to a face-to-face meetings when you come to the interviews?
I've actually held. I've been out of, as you know, I've been out of the country myself for most of the time. So I'm yet to do. I'm yet to do an interview post-COVID for the IET, but I have in the past done interviews via video link with people in India and Canada, and they work just as well. In fact, actually, they're quite good. They sometimes allow people to be a little bit more relaxed because they're in a familiar environment, and they just don't have to have all the hassle of the travel into London or elsewhere. So they start the interview more relaxed. Noticeably more relaxed, and generally they've been quite good interviews. We've had a few issues with bandwidth and video dropouts, but we've been able to overcome those. At the end of the day, as long as we can start the video into and assure ourselves the candidate is the person that they say they are, then we can conduct the rest of the interview, if necessary, with voice only. And we've done that on one occasion as well. So I would say that based on experience, there's no reason at all why we couldn't or the IET can't continue to use video conferencing. It's not setting the precedence for COVID. It's certainly something that's been done before.
Well, I think my impression is a lot of organisations will be moving to online meetings for routine events. I mean, certainly in my professional career, I've always liked the idea of you go meet somebody the first time when you're engaging in a new project with them, and thereafter you can carry on with email because you've had that human contact, you know, and it personalised rather than trying to do it all via email. So it's going to be a very sort of similar process, isn't it? You may have a face-to-face, well, 2 meters apart, and the rest of it's on Zoom. Right, okay. I'm going to let Lee McFadden ask his question. Lee's been waiting very patiently. So, Lee, I'm going to press the button and hopefully we'll be able to hear you. Hello, Lee, if you want to unmute your microphone, then we'll be able to hear you. Right, okay. Lee, for whatever reason, isn't able to unmute his microphone, so we'll just wait. We'll carry on for the moment. Sorry, Robert, and then with a bit of luck, he'll come in. Now, a few people have asked the question. I know you've, in essence, answered this, and I do know the answer, but I'm going to let you do it. That if somebody's been working in academia, where they teach or perhaps a research fellow, but don't have any budget responsibilities or managerial responsibilities, does that stop them from applying for successfully for CEng?
No, not at all, Andrew. Again, the whole thing is flexible because it appreciates the fact that engineering is such a broad discipline. So all it means is that you need to be, you need to measure your experience against the criteria. And the criteria, when I say that, the criteria is flexible in the way that it's written. It doesn't state specifically that you have to have financial responsibility, but it does talk about responsibility in the rounds. You may not have employees or subordinates within the organization, but if you're in academia, you're almost certainly working as part of a wider student body, and you may have responsibility directly for students under your care. So the whole idea of leadership and management, you need to take those concepts and apply it in the context that is most relevant to your experience. And actually, this is where the refinement comes in. You write the application to start with, have lots of gaps, or you may have lots of gaps against the criteria. The more you think about it, the more familiar you are rereading the criteria, the easier it becomes to slot your experience against that framework. And that's why going through the process end to end a few times and refining it and using the criteria framework to mark the evidence that you actually write down, so you can see dynamically as you develop it where the gaps might be and where you may need to go back and consider. And really, it's an exercise in reflective analysis. It really is. You have to reflect very carefully on what you've done and how what you've done is to the framework. And once you go around that process a few times, the pieces of the jigsaw drop in, and you may still find you have gaps, but then you've got a question to ask yourself: are you applying for the right? Are you aiming for the right level of registration, or indeed are you at the right time in your career to apply for registration at all? It should become evident from that process.
Okay, I'm going to see if Lee will come back, is able to come on the call, and if not, if he's unable to join in, I will move on to. Oh, hello, Lee. Do you want to ask a question? Oh, hello. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I dropped a little note there, but effectively, I just wanted to know, being from South Africa, I've spent most of my career there, at least more than half up to date. So I was wondering how you view EXA referees and the equivalence of someone registered with the Engineering Council in South Africa as a supporter.
Yeah, again, the see a lot of people that have got experiences based on working overseas, and the benefit of the UK EngSpec is there are parallels across other organisations, and so the area where this comes out most often is in academic qualifications, and the IET are able to advise very quickly on the eligibility of overseas qualifications against the UK standard, and similarly for supporters, if they are registered engineers against a sister organisation of the IET that is recognised by the Engineering Council as the awarding body. It's the Engineering Council, I think, that have the overarching view of which worldwide organisations have a similar level of accreditation. But certainly, yes, in principle, there is a mechanism to have those credentials validated either by the IET or by the Engineering Council on the advice of the IET. So there isn't an issue as far as I see at this stage.
Okay, thank you, Lee, for your question. And Jamil Chowdhury's got a question as well. Jamil, the floor is yours.
I just wanted to ask, please, is this webinar recorded, and is it a possibility to get a copy of it, please?
Yes, it is being recorded. I'm not sure how the recording can get to you, but Julie, who is our support at IET headquarters, is also on the call, and she'll be making notes about all these particular questions. And Julie's a tower of strength, keeps all of us in the local networks on track and doing the right thing at the right time. So she'll have picked up your question, and it's probably going to be sent out as a link, I would imagine, but somehow it will be got to you. Okay, well, thank you, both of you, for your questions. That's Lee and Jamil. Right. Robert, just running back to the questions, we'll just, I'm aware the time is coming on, and normally if we were holding this in a real site with this time, we'd be thinking only 20 minutes for the man comes, and it is a man, comes along and rattles his keys and sort of indicates he'd like you to step out of the building that we normally use. So we'll do a few more questions. A number of people asked, how does the IET go around checking the truth of information given, the validity of certifications and degrees that are quoted?
That side of things is all done in the stage 2 process. So the qualification, you have to provide evidence of your qualifications, and they're validated against the IET and the ENG. As I say, the ENG Council are the arbiters on whether or not it's a valid accredited degree or qualification, whatever the level of qualification. And there may be instances where it's not instantly obvious or validatable at that point, in which case the institute will seek further advice. I'm not aware, I've never seen an instance in my experience where a stated qualification hasn't been able to be verified to some degree. I've seen evidence where qualifications are validated, but they don't meet the minimum criteria as stated by the council. But I've certainly not seen the other instance where things can't be validated either positively or negatively.
Okay, well, I'm quite amused.
Is that okay? Is that?
Yeah, that's fine. Yes, I think that's absolutely fair. I'm quite amused that there's somebody who goes down as an anonymous attendee, probably, and it says, and you don't have to answer this, do the assessors verify what is presented at the interview? Don't answer that one. I'm just intrigued that somebody... it's a bit like saying...
Sorry, Andrew. Could you...
I'll say that again. Sorry. If you
repeat the question, you broke up.
Yeah. Sorry, I beg your pardon. This is from an anonymous attendee, okay? And they're asking, for practical purposes, do the assessors check what is presented at the interview? Don't answer that, because it's a bit like somebody coming around saying, I'll do your job cheaper if it's cash in hand. So I think we'll just, I think I know what they mean. You're going to dig beneath the surface, but on the face of it, it does look like a bit of an interesting question. Right. Right, Julie has just sent out a note on the chat sidebar, just saying that all the questions that you've been sent, and there's over 100 of them now, 106 actually right now, will be sent to you. I'm assuming that a lot of them you can group together, but Julie's saying, please give Robert some chance to answer 106 questions. It may take a few days to answer your question. Quite a lot of them are very, can be grouped. Right. A number of people have asked the question. I'm just going to summarize this about the problem, as we've discussed, about you're a one person business, and you may not have an immediate much more freelancers in the business and less big companies. So I suspect the answer is then you need to talk to a PRA and get some help there about getting some validation. I realise as a PRA you can't validate it, but you might be able to advise them who to go and talk to, because if they're working regularly with clients, you might have a client who is a CN you might be willing to support. Yeah, that would be my answer.
That's exactly. Yeah, that's exactly the way. And again, we see some really good. It's really, I can't stress how interesting it is, both being a PRA and a PRI, just from the breadth of experience and the people that are actively engaged in getting registration. And some of the best presentations come from those people that work in very small they are used to that environment to an unknown audience. So they're generally more confident in what they do, and they are more measured in their approach, and they are very good at showing validated evidence based on performance. So it's part and parcel of how they do their business normally.
Okay.
And so you're right there. The client base becomes quite an important evidence supporter of the evidence there.
Yes. Okay. Well, I think that's a nice answer, as I suspected that would be the answer. There are quite a number of similar related questions which are about moving from iEng or Eng Tech to CEng, and usually they're coupled with not having an MSc or an MEng, but that's usually by the experience route, isn't it, where you look for what you've actually done during your career, and you may have to just include a slightly longer timescale, a longer amount of data in your application under those circumstances. That's correct, isn't it?
It does, and again, it's quite. They tend to polarize those that are experienced and have the technical and the knowledge base to support their application without the academic qualification stand out against those that are simply putting an application because they're at a point in their career where they think they are owed that level of registration, if that makes sense. So very easy to see two different elements there. Yeah, they stand out by stark contrast.
Okay, well, I mean, I know one of the answers we've had previously from PRA is consult your local PRA, and that's true. But you can, for anybody who wants to make an application, you can always contact Stevenage and ask who is the PRA in your local area. There's a whole network of PRAs up and down the country. It happens Robert lives in South Bucks and therefore is one of the Bucks PRAs, but he's not limited to Bucks. He'll cover an area and each of the PRAs will, but do please contact the staff at Stevenage. If you contact the switchboard and ask for the PRA department, that they will help you. The switchboard is very helpful. Just describe what you want and they'll put you through to the right person. So do draw upon Stevenage headquarters to get this sort of help, and they'll direct you to a PRA who can help you and answer a lot of these questions. And if they're all like, sorry, go on, Janet.
Yeah, I've just put a link into the chat
right,
so you can find out who your local PRA is.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. Thanks very much indeed, Julie. That helps. And when we send out the slide pack, we'll, if you wouldn't mind including that link in with there so people can contact the nearest PRA to them, and then they can get a lot of help, because when it comes to very specific circumstances, it is best to talk to PRA. I used to be what they call it, I forget what the title was, a mentor, but it was a mentor plus for a biggish company, and a lot of people's applications were fairly standard, but you always got one that was a little bit unusual. My advice would always be contact the PRA, speak to a PRA, because one, I'm not allowed to give the advice, but secondly, it's clearly needs somebody to look at it with a fresh pair of eyes and to tease out the relevant information, which might not be obvious to me. I look at it and go, well, I can't obviously see where you meet the academic qualifications, but a PRA would be able to ask you lots of questions. So it's always worth doing that. I think, Robert, with the time, it comes now to close the meeting. As we said before, we will be sending out the slide pack to everybody who's attended. Judy will include the link, and there is also a recording available as well. I know one or two people have had glitches on their internet links. I can tell that from the messages I'm getting. That's always difficult. It's always difficult to know whether it's your link, the central link, Robert's link. Your guess is as good as mine. Robert, thank you very much indeed once again for giving your presentation. Hopefully this time next year we'll be able to see you face to face again in the Bucks New University campus. and we'll have a smaller audience because we will no way will we get 200 odd people into the rooms we normally get there. But thank you on behalf of IET Bucks for once again giving a most detailed and thoughtful presentation about how to become a chartered engineer. Thank you.
No, thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure. I'll be in touch.
Yeah, okay, I shall look forward to that. All right, for everybody on the call, that's it. Thank you very much indeed for joining this evening. Don't forget that if you live in and around the Bucks area, to look at the IET Bucks website at IET. Best thing is to Google IET Bucks events and you'll see what we're doing. And if you can come along to any events in the future, very much welcome you, and please introduce yourself to me. I'm usually at all the events we have.
Thank you for joining today's webinar. You are being held in the lobby. The webinar will be starting soon.